I'm fantastic.
So, welcome. So, public speeches, I've always been fine doing. And then coming to the university, my biggest insecurity in life was saxophone solo performance. I haven't done a presentation in a while, but I think that's okay. So, today we're talking about interaction, the extra premise for evaluating game music. So, what is fair judgment? Regarding budgets and artistic design for game music. So this is a very broad measurement that we're going to dive into a little bit. We're not going to go into the individual budgets and artistic design, but it's kind of asking where did a lot of this start and where did a lot of game music start in the origin, but also when you listen to game music, do you consider the premises that were made for that song? So the first quote comes from Joan Bion and Christian Loeb, and it says, regardless of genre, the sensory stimuli components in digital games not only help create the aesthetic display that stimulates players' senses, but also attract players to the gameplay. In other words, these sensory game elements are the very factors that draw players into the game environment for interaction, and thus may play an important role in increasing learners' engagement. Additional criteria for evaluating game music. I'm going to today talk about, again, there's limitation, and then there's also artistic intent of the song. But then when I go over the song, there's also going to be the overarching game that it contributes to. Because we're talking about, I originally came into this study going, okay, I want to show why game music is so good as an opinionated thing, trying to convince of opinion. But my teacher told me about, I was actually educated about confirmation bias, and I actually did not know about that before. And so when I was looking up these sources online, I was going for my favoritism. But he's like, you should just, at the start, make an annotated bibliography and just do a bunch of research on what is game music, why do people make game music. Not in a specific search, more of I just started researching about game music and its development and as an art form. And relevancy, context of product, an album and a game. Okay, so I'm going to play a quick bit from the album Megaman Resonant V. So that came from an album called Megaman Resonant V, and the intent of that was to take the soundtrack of Mega Man Zero, which was an early 2000s game on the Game Boy Advance, and the purpose was take the game away and let's just make an album of the music that was made. The premise of Mega Man is they're robots, and so the guy for the album, the arranger, said, well, what if it was human-like? The music in Mega Man is supposed to be robotic. He's like, I want to make an album with authentic instruments, keep the music intact, but let's arrange it like with just real instruments, nothing synthetic. Here's the original song on the Game Boy Advance with its MIDI instruments and limitations. Something to consider is the gameplay involvement and that it contributes to the game itself rather than just being an album song. So the interesting part about that is you think I'd be almost undermining that, saying, oh, this is for a game and is contributing to something bigger. But the interesting part about that is I personally thought the song was still good, even under like a Game Boy Advance and not being intended for an album. And that's a big part about my presentation today is even with limitations and other criteria that game composers had to make their music for, a lot of it still ended up sounding pretty musically, I'm not going to say viable because that's, again, opinionated, but again, from my point of view, I think it sounds good, and so it's an interesting comparison. I always play the album, the first album, the orchestrated album, in the car, and my friends always go, what is this? I go, it's Mega Man. They always look at me like, are you kidding me? So that's always a nice thing to have. So yeah, limitations and intention. The intention of an album while the intention of a game. So what are possible criteria used to evaluate game music? This one is from Tim Summers. I reason that since music's significance for the gamer is founded upon the way the player interacts with the game, and that the nature of this interaction is determined by the game genre, then musical analysis of game genres is an appropriate and potentially rewarding way of understanding game music. The musical analysis of interactive genres, in turn, illuminates the way in which gamers play games. Because of the interactive mechanism of the game, genres prioritize distinct modes of player interaction and components of musical function. The focus of an individual game genre can bring out the specific functional concerns of that genre and the musical aesthetics resulting from those concerns. So game categories, they do serve as a framework. I'm going to dive in a little bit about when game music first started. There were categories of games like platformers and adventure games, but game music was so new at the time, they just wanted to develop that. They wanted to develop what is effective game music and sound design for a game. But as time went on, we started to really break apart the categories of a racing game, a shooting game, a platformer game, adventure game. So as time goes on and the expansion of technology happens, they're like, how can we better emulate that environment for whatever the game demands? So genre and limitation, post and pre-framework. So I did the category introduction, but again, we're going to look back real quick before when games did have early categories, but the sound and the music itself was in its infancy. So this game is called Tetrasphere. I'm going to show you two puzzle games today. This one was on the Nintendo 64 in the mid-90s, and this video is going to show you, you're going to see the gameplay demand, and then listen to the music as it adds to the gameplay demand and how it can immerse a player. So obviously there's a lot going on in that game, and it actually does have a high learning curve. So the composer Neil Voss, he wanted to push. By the time of the N64, there was more audio samples he could use, and so he's like, I can make this music louder. Because when you listen to NES or Super Nintendo music, the 8 and 16-bit music, there was even like a volume limitation because of the MIDI. But by the time of the 64, he's like, okay, I can elaborate the volume. This game needs, there's a lot of sounds going on. I don't want the music to distract you too much. I want it to get you pumped. So the other example is in contrast, because it's earlier, there's Dr. Mario, and so that's on the NES, earlier puzzle game. Now look at the demand for Dr. Mario compared to Tetrasphere. Obviously, a lot more simple, but it wasn't just because of, the composer said, I want to make a more simple song for this. It was because the NES only allowed 4 instruments to play at a time for its music. So does limitation hold back a vision? The interesting part about that is, as we look at the early history of limitation, that pushes innovation. So by being limited, can one theoretically not be bounded by that limitation and push beyond that to create essentially a genre that we know as game music that establishes trends that we see even to this day. So real quick, we're going to talk about the NES. This is basically where game music mainly started. You heard game music in arcades, but before then you had the Atari and stuff like that, and it didn't have the capabilities really to play a lot of background music. So real quick, before we dive in a little bit into NES music, this is tracker software that emulates how the NES did its music. You can see obviously the labeling for how a note is engraved. So this one is from Kevin Driscoll. Just as the barriers to making computer music lowered with the availability of tracking tools, so did chiptune composers create a new space for sharing their work. In the 1980s, commercial computer games typically included additional software to limit their unauthorized reproduction. With each release, adept reverse engineers set about circumventing the new constraints. And this was discussed in my research paper, and I just wanted to bring it up briefly. He then continues on that as time went on, more companies were less secure about keeping their techniques and their technology of this type of music to themselves. And they realized that if we shared this with more people, then we can then other users can add to the innovative technology of chiptune music and engraving the music for it. So 1983 was the new frontier for games and music for the NES. And like I mentioned before we had the NES, we had the Atari. I'm going to real quick play Donkey Kong from the Atari, and you can kind of notice some of the soundscape in it. So with respect to the Atari 2600, cool home game console, but there wasn't background music like in the arcade version. Some people would argue at the time, well, this is just amazing by itself. I can play at home. So when the NES came out, what could be added to that? The technology was added, and it was just enough where they said, we could make background music, but where do we start with background music? What's it gonna sound like for a game? We're gonna be a player could be stuck in a level forever, so we have to make sure the game loops well, and it melodically, I wouldn't call it addictive, but it melodically wouldn't get tiresome, because you can have a bad player playing a game, it'll be stuck for a while. So I'm going to show an early NES song. This is from Manami Matsume, this is from the first Megaman, and this is on the tracker technology. So what you're about to see is there was a program that came out over 10 years ago called FamiTracker, and what it was is it emulated the limitations of the NES. And so composers could, for more work, go back and write music like it was on the NES on tracker technology. So that was a small bit from Manami Matsume's work, and she was the first composer for the Megaman franchise. So what you saw again was kind of a structure of NES music, and when you have only 4 instruments, you usually are condensed to melody, harmony, bass, and percussion. And there was one more channel, but that was for sound effects. And so if a game needed more than one layer of sound effects, it would usually borrow the melody or the harmony instrument, which is why sometimes when you play a game and there's a bunch of stuff on screen, you don't hear the music incomplete. It's like 75% there. So establishing compositional staples for the genre. This is from Manami Matsume when she got hired by Capcom. During my 4th year of college, I was thinking about what I wanted to do after graduating, and I thought about becoming a piano teacher since I was majoring in it. One day, I happened to see a job hunting bulletin at university, which said that Capcom was recruiting people who could create music. At the time, game music wasn't something they're hiring for. Hope they do it for me now, that'd be awesome. But what they did hire is they hired classical musicians, because where else were they gonna look at? And so that is an interesting, her, and even in the 90s, the composers like Grant Kirkhope, who was classically trained, but they didn't have any realm of game music. Obviously with people like her, she was creating this genre. And so that just kind of gives you a good backtrack of the roots of the standards of game music and where it kind of comes from. So, you know, hired classical musicians. So again, we heard that first Mega Man song. Now this is a couple years later with Mega Man 4, which only came out a few years later on the NES. And this had a different composer, but you can already tell the trends were set for how this music sounds. So there just wasn't a lot of memory for these songs. Again, they had to be pretty short. So when you're limited by your length and by the data size of the songs, you're gonna have to push as much as you can of what song is like, how much time you have on the song. So that's why I think the song's catchy. It depends on anyone else, but usually that's when reviewers will say, oh, Mega Man music was pretty effective at me getting it stuck in my head because they had to push that melody because it was only gonna loop every 30 seconds. So this one's just, I love this as a control group. It's almost an eye roller for some people because you hear it from winter percussion bands all the time. But this really was one of the forefront songs in establishing the trends for game music. It loops pretty fast. Again, people ironically now get tired of it just because of how overplayed it is. But really at the time, Koji Kondo was like, okay, I gotta play a song that you could be stuck on the level forever. How could you not be tired of it? So this one comes, from Michael Camp, and he says, the total coherence learner notes is striking. This is an analysis of someone else analyzing Super Mario Brothers. and is even more prevalent in his analysis of the later Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack. There, too, Lerner draws connections with early cinema techniques, the game's soundtrack offering a playful combination of pastiche and unity. Chris Tonelli's chapter of the Japanese game-inspired Pico Pico music scene might seem to be less directly about music in video games, but it helps us better understand one or more prominent subculture offshoots of the subject, so-called chiptune or 8-bit music. So, artistic impressions. Innovation under limitation is timeless. And what I mean by that is, so far, some of these songs, again, it's by your word of opinion, but I personally think they have lasted musically, and we've seen already with arrangements that you can take a limited song with a limited instrument palette and then add instrumentation to it, and it still sounds good as just a song. But remember, these songs weren't written just to sound good musically. They were written to be a part of a gameplay experience so players don't get tired of it. So this one is the same song I played before, the Megaman song, the first one, but this one is done by the Swedish Radio Symphony. So obviously, there are a lot more instruments there, but the consistency of the song still remains, and you could easily tell, oh, it's the song that was played earlier. Or to me, I was like, oh my gosh, like, where's my ticket? I want to go to this. So without limitation, what would game music sound like from its birth? This is a what-if scenario. This is the least studied part about the research, but it's something to consider because the time period was similar, and it's relevant to the duology between cinema music and game music. So imagine if game music was never made, and they're like, we gotta have music for our games. This is a good action scene, right? So they were like, oh, we could probably use this. But the philosophy of John Williams' music was for, each scene. It wasn't for to be really repeated over and over again. It wasn't for how can a player feel like they're progressing. We'll discuss a little bit later how a player will feel like they're progressing in the game by sound cues and layering. What's interesting I wanted to put here is they actually ended up putting Star Wars music into a Super Nintendo for Star Wars games because they didn't need to hire a composer. Oh, just use John Williams' music. I think it sounds all right, but it's okay if you don't like it. So John Williams wasn't working with these limitations, but someone at the studio had to make sure they just jam it into a Super Nintendo and it sounds all right, So now, Mega Man music in 2018, Mega Man 11 came out last year, and like I said with the last Mega Man song that was on Mega Man 4, they still kept the consistency of what Mega Man music is. And I think Mega Man music is kind of a good anchor towards game music philosophy and how it's designed. So take a quick listen to how they're writing Mega Man music in 2018. Now listen to it when it's put back into an NES limitation of just 4 instruments. So there's a lot of things that are very similar there. The melody was intact, the counter melodies, the bass. And I think that was a big part of NES music. That's all they had. So when you focus on that musically, it can just sound good no matter the transitions of technology. So experience, the prime directive for making game music plus retrospect. So musical control groups. This one is from Juan Bion and Christian S. in a research that the notion that sensory stimuli could work to engage players in digital gameplay is not new. Consumer experience research has already confirmed that sensory stimuli are important elements that can influence consumers' engagement. The theory that sensory stimuli could have an effect on game players' engagement is also supported by psychological research. For example, Fredericks, Blumenfield, and Paris regarded engagement as a multidimensional psychological construct, including behavioral, emotional, and cognitive aspects. In the case of emotional engagement, students who are positively engaged would experience effective reactions, and on one end of a continuum, and regressing into boredom if they weren't engaged, or the rejection of learning of the experience if it wasn't extreme or heightened. So, interesting is we covered Star Wars, but what if Star Wars Episode 4 was judged by itself? We look back on Star Wars Episode 4, we're like, wow, that's a cool movie, and that was a good movie for sci-fi, establishing a very big trend that's big, like, in its own regards. But what if Star Wars Episode 4 what if it was evaluated by itself? We're not evaluating, like, oh, what it contributed to as the art form for itself. And I think that's a lot of what game music was for. They're not trying to say, oh, we gotta make a good game song like all the other game songs. We gotta make a good game song for the game. Because that's the goal, that's the big, that's the good accumulation of all its parts for different forms of design. So due to the primary objective of player interaction and enjoyment with the product, it also seems unfair to evaluate and compare artistic media in a game to the same evaluation standards as a classical composition or art piece. So unconscious context. This was from Michael Newman. In making these arguments, Altus shows an affinity with art, historical, and musicological studies matching the tools of the artistic in their historical context with the expressive potential possible under the constraints of a medium, style, or any horizon of possibilities. He shows the Nintendo game developers of the 1980s to be creative visionaries, not just programmers of gameplay, but also composers for the novel instrument of the Famicom processor, which is NES in Japan. Being introduced, so this is a personal experience. The Dr. Mario song you heard earlier, I was not introduced to in Dr. Mario. I was introduced to it years later in a fighting game, which again is a different category of game. But musically, I still liked it. And I looked back, I was like, oh, it sounds the same, but the limitations are lifted. That obviously wasn't in the context of a puzzle game or a slow puzzle game, but it was something that I got and I enjoyed musically, and so that kind of gauged my way of just liking game music itself. But I didn't look at the broader picture of what it contributed to, because by itself I was like, okay, I really like that song. So again, judging the artistic sum, but the parts can still be positively isolated. So in this case, again, I wasn't looking at, oh, Super Smash Bros. Melee has good artists are working on it, good programmers, good sound designers. I was just by itself, I was like, wow, that song's good. Oh, the soundscape's good. So the importance of player progression with sound. This one is from, This one's from Scott Steinmetz. He says, we developed a computational framework that treats interception as a dynamic decision-making process under uncertainty. In our dynamic Bayesian model, the pursuer continuously updates its belief about catchability based on informational variables, such as relative target distance and time until the target reaches an escape region. These beliefs shift based on the likelihood of detecting each variable at a given value. So basically, this study was based upon, they were tracking a player's involvement, and they wanted step by step to see if there were certain cues in the game that would let the player be motivated, say, oh, I gotta keep going, or if they weren't motivated. There's more to it, but with time, I'm gonna move on real quick, but relevant to the topic, the evaluation of fluctuating confidence from a player. So how does music contribute to this? One of my favorite video games is Yoshi's Island, and it's overworld, there's 6 worlds in it, and obviously when you reach to world 6, you're about done with the game. But musically, the composer Koji Kondo wanted the player to know they are making progress. So listen to a little bit of the overworld song as you go to another world. So again, there's enough technology to layer on instruments for the Super Nintendo to allow the player to feel like they were making progression. So present day influence and experimental comparison to more modern day games. This is about the time period where games and sound design started to branch off. You didn't just have one line of a philosophy of making effective game music. Now as adventure and shooter games had the technology increase for soundscape, they wanted to focus more on that because it's more of an isolated experience. So adventure games now with the soundscape. So this is an interview, with a quick 1-minute interview snippet I took of Jeremy Stoll, who's the composer of Skyrim.
Well, it kind of, I want to say that, every composer out there would love to be able to produce his or her personal vision for a project. And, that's ideal, if you can do that. Because what happens is, if you, as a composer, even with the best composers, if you have a lot of input coming from a lot of different places, the music starts to sound schizophrenic. and it can drive a composer crazy. Decision by committee is one of the worst things in the world, and I think it's like architecture is the same thing. You have an architect that comes in, and generally the greatest architects are the ones that I think have really the force of personality to push through and say, no, this is what I'm going to do. And occasionally, you hit an impasse in a project, and I'll admit I've been fired off projects. I've read stories about other major Hollywood composers who've been in similar positions that, they had a disagreement with the director, and they just couldn't reconcile it creatively, and they departed the project. And I think there's something to be said about artistic integrity, and probably at this point in my life, people know what I do. They know what I write, and I enjoy what I do. So when you have a good creative mix, like we had on Elder Scrolls, I've produced over 100 games, and I've only had a couple of misfires. I would have to say, it's rare. It's rare you get that kind of creative connection. And the game was wildly successful. The music was just one part of it. I mean, there's so much going on with those games, and of course, there was so much genius creativity that went into things. I like the fact that they had an astronomer who designed a star system.
So, if you don't know, Skyrim is one of the most critically acclaimed adventure games so far in the present day, and like he said, he was just one contributor to a bigger scale, but he was involved with a lot of the music for it. What's interesting about the music in this game, though, is it's more based on cues. So with music cues, it's only about certain achievements you get in the game, rather than what we've heard before of like an overlapping background music that continuously plays. So modern versus classic audio design. Growing budgets split the roles of sound design. Correlation of limitations with the need of background music, splitting the past for game categories. There's still games now, like Sonic, that use background music that continuously plays. But now there's games like The Elder Scrolls that don't need music playing all the time because it's more focused on sound immersion with the player. More of like, oh, I want to hear footsteps or something like that. Original design philosophy is still viable, though. Obviously, Sonic games are doing good, Mario games are doing good. They keep hiring these people to write in that format. So absence is context. Sound cues isn't music. I think it's more of just good design because we want to look at music compositionally. But I think contributing to the bigger picture of a game, I think it's great. Demands and intent of modern games. Again, as technology got better and games got bigger budgets, you don't hire just the Megaman composer who also did the sound at the time. You now are hiring a composer, you're hiring a sound designer, you're hiring a Foley sound designer, voice actor engineers. There's just a bunch of work now that goes on with just sound by itself. So this game is called TF2. It's a first-person shooter, and again, it didn't use its music for actual gameplay. It used it more for anything else, trailers and menus. So this is a brief song from Team Fortress 2 to demonstrate the effort that was put into it, but it never was actually used in the game. Consistency of absence. I'm just going to abbreviate this real quick. This one's from Mike Morosky on Valve. He basically just said, I want to have interactions like what Valve has shown in the music you just heard. This is someone that was criticizing Valve for saying, well, I like the old game design. I want to hear that music while I play. But does that actually help for the general audience of game immersion? So enjoying the music alone or desiring application. We can enjoy music by itself, but as a composer, I'm not going to feel down if my director said we can't use this song for the actual game, but use it for a trailer. You have to understand the application of the product. So real quick, I'll do a minute of Skyrim's gameplay standards. This is, again, for the branching path of adventure games. And notice the absence of game music, but rather an intent on elaborating sound design for the player.
A well-placed word or a well-placed dagger, both can achieve equal purposes.
You've been a good friend to me. Fine. What? What? Will do.
So, loops, but for good reason. No context impressions of genre. Real quick, in the present study, musical emotion was measured continuously for classical, popular, and game music. So this was a study Masashi Yamada did. They played classical, pop, and game music randomly for listeners. And they wanted to ask, what's your impression of it? And the impression was generally consistent. They just said, oh, I like this, I like this, I like this. I would go into more detail, it's in my actual paper on it, but it was really interesting to have that all three of them were consistently appealing for a wider range of audience members. So there is a gray area of classical, pop, and game. There's more sources than just this where people will critically evaluate music. That was actually my original intention of this thesis, was to say, hey, game music is up there with the other two. But as I studied, I was like, I need to go more into how game music is effective with the interactions of the player, because that's kind of what it was made for. So evaluate the experience. That's kind of the main intent, despite game music. Despite game music and its necessity to be judged for its role in gameplay first, it is important to regard these sources that demonstrate the viability game music has as a listening medium with the interactive context that is taken away and can still be enjoyed as a standalone song. Stasha blanks the importance of music in video games. That was the quote there. So branches of compositional quality. The widest audience to cater to for sound design. Again, this was briefly talked about before with if I was designing for, let's say, Skyrim, and I thought a song should play during gameplay, but my director was like, don't do that because the general audience needs to feel immersed with the game itself. That's the end desired product. I used to write game music just to sound as good game music, but then later I was like, I should emulate an area I'm writing for, so that way I can get more prepared for the professional world of they're gonna give you a criteria to write your music for. So this again, with the two branchings of gameplay, there still is the old traditional branching of gameplay that is still used in games like Mario and Sonic. Take a quick listen to the title theme in the newest Mario Party game. But notice that like a lot of title themes loop really fast. So I'll talk to that. Obviously, you're not going to be on a title screen that long. It tells you to press start. So they're going to make a small loop of that song, but they still wanted to put a lot of effort into the song itself. So the split of formulas, but all for the sake of gameplay immersion. So again, we talk about the branching. Even though the main branch that was established by the NES said, okay, we want to have good game music, its intent still was just to make sure the player felt immersed in the game, with also sound design as Escape itself. So closing remarks. What will games demand next for soundscape? That is interesting. I could cover VR. That would totally be like another 30-minute something presentation of what VR can contribute to sound design. And that's what it really is more focusing on, is sound design rather than the music. VR is literally that off branch going even further. And I'm not worried about it, but I probably should buy my own VR headset as I prepare for this, because they're going to interview me and they're going to be like, oh, okay, you do some sound work. What's your experience with VR? Oh, shoot, you know. So my last closing remark, I just wanted to say that it seems that while peer-reviewed expectations of quality for game music changes over time, it is important to regard the song's contribution to player interactions first, and then if the song can hold its own musically in a vacuum. Regardless, the entire product should always be considered when reviewing and placing opinions on music contained in the art known as video games. Thank you.